Welcome everybody to the sacrament of Shabbat, and good Shabbos to everybody. Today we begin a new discussion over the series of the next weeks, and it's about Ecclesiastes, life under the sun. So Ecclesiastes, or the book of Ecclesiastes, is found in the Hebrew Testament, and it is a book that stems from what is called the wisdom schools. So it comes later than the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And it's an extension and also an evolution of Judaic thought. And as we'll see, Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus, was highly influenced by these wisdom traditions. So this is part 1 of a series of lessons on Ecclesiastes. So Jesus was influenced by Jewish prophetic and wisdom traditions. Jesus' teachings, as presented in the Christian Testament, show he was highly influenced by the Babylonian Jewish wisdom schools, which produced the Pentateuch, Deutero and Trito Isaiah, Job, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, as well as intertestamental Enochian literature. The Son of Mankind collective Messiah, this idea of a communion of saints, of an anointed humanity, comes from the book of Daniel and 1 Enoch, where it expressly talks about the Baranash. Concepts about resurrection and divine ascent that Jesus teaches about in the Christian Testament and elsewhere are based from Isaiah and Ezekiel. Jeremiah is quoted or alluded to about 125 times throughout the Christian Testament. And Jeremiah's major contribution is that of the prophecy of the new covenant. So there are many covenants that were broken throughout the Hebrew Testament. And I don't want this to become confused with ahistorical ideas about Jesus. We talk about the probable historical teachings of Jesus. When you look at Jesus's teachings, he said that everybody must fulfill the law, that not even one letter can be missing from the law. So the law is the Torah. So Jesus was fully supportive of following the Torah. It was only much later with Paul, who was not a direct disciple of Jesus. He never met Jesus, and he probably met some people from the Jewish Christian churches in Jerusalem and the surrounding area when he made visits. And that was quite problematic for both churches, the Jerusalem church and the Gentile churches headed by Paul. But anyhow, it was Paul that gave the ahistorical, erroneous idea that we did not need to follow Torah anymore. That you only need to believe in Jesus and his resurrection, and then you're magically saved. Jesus will just take on all of your issues, all of your problems, and whitewash them, right? That's not what the new covenant was. The new covenant was a covenant of love with God. It was a radical reinterpretation of the Jewish covenant with God. Jesus, in many ways, criticized, directly or indirectly, the way that Pharisees and Sadducees were interpreting Torah, the Pharisees and Sadducees of his time. And Jesus himself was a Galilean Pharisee, so he had the right to speak up. It wasn't like he was a subordinate, uneducated person raging against the machine. He was a highly educated Jew, and he was a Pharisee himself, and the Galilean Pharisees tended to be more heart-centered, more shamanic in their approach, and the Judean Pharisees that Jesus spoke against were very legalistic, interpreting every letter, every word of the Hebrew Testament and giving guidance to their students as to how that law should be carried out, etc. And Jesus felt that a lot of these rabbinic rulings or pre-rabbinic rulings were unfair, that they were man-made, and that they didn't lead somebody to heavenly consciousness or a closer relationship with God. So Jesus' new covenant was rooted in and informed by the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, also other intertestamental works like the Enochian literature. and he advised a more heart-centered rather than head-centered approach to Judaism. So Jesus did not teach Christianity. Jesus perceived himself as a reformer of Judaism, coming to a heart-centered approach to God. And that is the new covenant that was prophesied in Jeremiah. So Jesus was a Jewish sage who was more influenced by Judaic evolutionary thought and religious practices initiated by the prophets and wisdom traditions. So a lot of people thought back in the day that Ecclesiastes was heretical. So was it heretical? And what was the basis of considering it heretical? So the name of the book, Ecclesiastes, comes from the word used for the teacher who is quoted in the book. In Hebrew, the word is koheleth, meaning gatherer. Martin Luther, who was the founder of the Protestant churches, translated it as preacher. In the Septuagint, translators into Greek, pardon me, in the Septuagint, translators made Ecclesiastes in the ancient Greek form as it appears on the screen with the same pronunciation, which refers to a member of an assembly. And if you don't know what the Septuagint is, I didn't when I first heard the word. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because a lot of Jews were being displaced. As you know, they're being thrown out of their homeland, thrown out of Jerusalem, dispersed through Rome, through Babylon, through Persia, a lot of areas around and in proximity to Jerusalem and Israel. So a lot of these Jews were born into a place where their main language was Greek, and their scriptural language was Hebrew. So the Septuagint was a translation for the benefit of Greek-speaking Jews in the diaspora. And it also became the version of the Hebrew Testament that Greek-speaking Christians used to develop their ideas about Jesus and to find various proof texts that proved that Jesus was the Messiah, that proved that he suffered and died for the sins of the world, etc. So that's what the Septuagint is. Although never mentioned by name, the famous King Solomon is thought to be the teacher referred to in Ecclesiastes. So this book was permitted into the Jewish canon long before there was many questions brought up about it. But when we don't understand something, we tend to bastardize it. We tend to say it's a bad thing. So, and that's a human trend that extends into modern day. When we don't understand something or someone, we try to demonize it. And that's what happened with Ecclesiastes too, after it was already admitted into the Jewish canon. So here's what it says in the New Oxford Annotated Bible with Apocrypha. Others, rabbis, Jewish leaders, question the book's intellectual value with expressions of discomfort about the book's contradictions. Still others challenged its moral value. The Pesikta de Rab Kahana reports that earlier sages considered suppressing the book because it might encourage hedonism and smacked of heresy. So a lot of people, when they don't understand something, especially spiritual satire, which is what I kind of classify Ecclesiastes as, it was kind of like dry humor. I do believe that the writer or writers of Ecclesiastes may have been a little bit bitter, but I think they had a very interesting perspective. And if you don't understand that satirical, almost humorous approach that the writers took with writing Ecclesiastes, you could start to think that it's almost, what do you want to call it? Unsanctimonious? I don't know how else to say it. Or maybe irreverent at times. I think those are good words to say. But again, it can only be considered irreverent if you don't catch the drift of the authors. So that's hopefully what I would like to share with you in the next few classes about Ecclesiastes, is that it's a satire about life, about spirituality, about expectations of God and expectations of humanity. And if you don't understand it, then it's easy to say that, oh, this is really dark. Oh, it's saying that life is meaningless. And that in itself would be almost heretical for ancient Jews, because the world and everything in it came from God. So essentially everything was good, right? So if you're calling the world and worldly experience meaningless, or the spiritual path meaningless, it seems like you're insulting God if you don't understand it. And the same thing happened with the Songs of Solomon, which we'll talk about in future lessons down the road. It's a very body, almost sexualized allegory for the spiritual path. And rabbis weren't allowed to study it until after they reached the age of 50 or beyond, because it was perceived that you needed to have a little bit of spiritual wisdom under your belt before you can even open that book and read it, because it was so misunderstood and gave people license to do things that they shouldn't do if they didn't understand the proper context of that text. So both Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs are very deep, deep spiritual works that can lead one to the heights of spiritual perfection if you really understand them. So this was one book that would have definitely inspired Mar Yeshua and inspired the way he taught his disciples, both ancient and modern day. So when was Ecclesiastes written? Despite its traditional associations with Solomon, most scholars date Ecclesiastes sometime during the late Persian and early Hellenistic periods, somewhere between 450 and 250 BC. The presence of two Persian loanwords, Hebrew pardes and pitgam, are what alerts us that it has a Persian background. The influence of Aramaic and various grammatical characteristics of post-exilic Hebrew strongly suggest that it was written after the rise of Persian rule across Southwest Asia in 539 BC. And this whole purple area on the screen is the Empire of Persia, which ruled and exiled the Jews from Jerusalem. But ultimately, they let people go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the Second Temple. So perhaps they weren't as destructive as the Romans were to the Jews in that area, the diaspora. Perhaps. So one reason I believe why it was considered heretical is because of how people translated the Hebrew word hebel or havel, depending on who you hear and who you ask. So is everything vanity or meaningless? Often we see the translation vanity of vanities. He says it throughout, or everything is vanity in Ecclesiastes. And in other more modern biblical translations, you'll see everything is meaningless. These wrong translations of the Hebrew term hebel are the likely causes of some calling it inappropriate or even heretical. And even if we don't consider it heretical, it can make the intended meaning of the author or authors skewed or misunderstood greatly. Some did not appreciate or understand the wisdom, humor, and sharp sarcasm of the writers of Ecclesiastes. It was a book about reforming Judaic ideas, and as with all reforms, as with all evolutions, there's an older group of people that tend to not want to budge. They don't want to grow into the future. So Ecclesiastes was probably sharply rebuked by those people that were used to older ways and were resisting commentary against older ways and older ways of living, so on and so forth. So, and again, I would agree. If you said that everything is meaningless, if you understood the word hebel to be meaningless, and you said everything is meaningless, well, that's kind of like, what help is this scripture? I mean, maybe it's not even heretical, but how helpful is it to me if you're just telling me that everything is meaningless? If everything is meaningless, then Why do I go to worship God in any context, in any tradition? If living, life, the world, our interaction in the world, our interaction with God is meaningless and futile, then what's the point of it? So that's where it kind of comes into being heretical too, because if everything is meaningless, what's the point of me going to the second temple to worship? What's the meaning of me going to church to worship or a modern day synagogue? If it's all meaningless, then I don't need that. And that can be perceived as heretical or inappropriate or even hedonistic, meaning ungodly or animal like, lower nature. And so I really do believe that this word, hebel, is the crux of whether you understand it as to be heretical or something of spiritual value. And I obviously believe it's of great spiritual value, otherwise I wouldn't be sharing it here with you. So let's go into this word a little bit deeper, according to our tradition that I come from, the apostolic lineage that I come from. So hebel, often spelled havel, does not mean vanity or meaninglessness. You have to understand nuance whenever you read scripture. So hebel, and Ecclesiastes means illusion, illusion, or possibly illusion of illusions. Very different word. The Hebrew word hebel refers to the illusory impermanence of the world, of people, places, things, even the whole universe. Everything is illusory is the correct understanding of this wisdom tradition and the point that it's trying to drive home to us. Vanity of vanities implies a sense of worthlessness, futileness, or, as some translations have it, meaninglessness. And vanity of vanities can even be taken totally wrong because there's a different definition of vanity that means pridefulness. Like a vanity can be that you're looking in the mirror and admiring how beautiful you are, or just admiring any quality about yourself is also a different definition for vanity. But vanity is also synonymous in other definitions given as a sense of worthlessness, futileness, or as meaninglessness. And although these things may be concepts that the writer spoke about, it was more important to understand that they considered the world as an illusion, as illusory, as impermanent, as undependable, which could be another good word to use. So the world is not meaningless. It's only by being incarnated in the world that we can grow spiritually. We can't grow spiritually in the afterlife. It's what we do here and now that the Jews understood purified our hearts and our minds and made us worthy to experience heavenly realms or experiences after clinical death occurred. So the world and our interaction with it is a vehicle for and a catalyst for spiritual growth. So definitely the world and these bodies and our experiences in the world and it's a schoolhouse. It's absolutely necessary and it's not meaningless, even though sometimes we might feel that way. However, the world and everything associated with that imagery, that symbol, it is illusory and it is impermanent because nothing of this world can bring permanent joy, ease, or comfort. Everything is always changing. And that's what's important to get, especially as we explore the different verses of Ecclesiastes next week and the weeks to follow. The idea of impermanence and illusory nature is that it changes. It's not that the world is an illusion or unreal. It's not that kind of an illusion. It's illusory in the fact that it always changes and it gives the illusion of permanence, the illusion of groundedness. But then just when we're grounded and comfortable in life, something gets pulled out from underneath our feet, right? Something we didn't expect happens. And it makes us uncomfortable. And it causes us to either get stuck in the mud or it propels us forward to more growth, depending on how we process that unexpected event or trauma. So, but what tends to happen for most humans is that we expect permanent pleasure from impermanent things. And that is what causes suffering. That is the key of suffering, is to understand that when we expect something impermanent to give us permanent happiness, we're going to be very disappointed and we're going to suffer or get frustrated whenever the car breaks down, the plumbing goes bad in our house, our girlfriend breaks up with us. Any bad thing that happens, our health goes bad, whatever it is. There's all kinds of things that pull the rug out from underneath us and make us have to reevaluate our life and our relationship with life and with spirituality. So the main idea in Ecclesiastes, in my opinion, is that everything is illusory, in that the world makes all these promises, people, places, things, churches, synagogues, make all these promises of some sort of permanent happiness. Whether it's through ideologies, concepts, etc., there is no permanent happiness in this world. The only permanent happiness we have is the relationship of the soul with God and the union of the two, the marriage of the two. That is the only permanent happiness that can happen, and that's what we strive for. That's what we strive to be conscious of. Of course, we're always within God. We live, move, and breathe in God literally, but most of us aren't aware of it. The point is to become aware of it and to experience this spiritual marriage with God where we're always conscious of God, where we're always acting for God and for God's creation in a purely loving, purely conscious way. So that's what it is. The fact that everything changes, life and death, the seasons, to everything there's a time for change, as Ecclesiastes talks about. This change is the basis for illusion. And the illusion is that any of that can give us permanent joy. So it's trying to strip away through tools like satire and sarcasm all the different ideas about what we think can give us pleasure. And they go through everything. And that's often why it's called hedonistic or heretical too by some, is that just like a comedian doesn't let any group of people go from that sting of his humor, Ecclesiastes didn't let anything go in the world or spirituality. It addressed everything about its illusory nature and how we have to cut through the illusory nature of everything to get to what is truly real, what is truly important, and what can really give us permanent happiness. And if you don't take it the right way, it could become very depressing, right? It's not that we shouldn't enjoy our family, enjoy the things that we like to do that are outside of spirituality that make our life fun. Yes, enjoy life, but understand that none of those things that you enjoy will give you permanent pleasure. At some point, it'll all go away. If you reflect deeply on this, you'll find the truth in it. So what Ecclesiastes is urging us to do is to seek for that one thing that is permanent, and that is God. God beyond anything that he or she can give us in this world, and God beyond any dogma, any doctrine, God beyond Judaism, God beyond Christianity, God beyond any ism, just getting to the pure consciousness of things, getting to the pure love of things. In my opinion, that's what Ecclesiastes is about. Here we find many definitions used for hebel in Strong's Hebrew Dictionary of the Bible. Here they say that hebel means emptiness. Isn't that interesting? Because the world is full of empty promises. So are a lot of preachers and rabbis. Sorry, I'm one of them, so I can say that, right? So emptiness, whether it's in word or deed or expecting to be fulfilled by anything from God. Pardon me, let me rephrase that. Expecting to be fulfilled by anything other than God is hebel. It'll always turn up empty. And that emptiness is the vanity that they try to express when they say vanity, which is poor. It doesn't get the idea across for modern day people. So figuratively, it's something transitory. Transitory is something that changes, something that's illusory and unsatisfactory, because ultimately we will be disappointed by everything that we expect to give us permanent happiness in this world. And that's why anything you can do in the world, or anything you could do even when you talk hermeneutics or when you discuss religion like we do here all the time, it's vain, it's vanity, it's empty if you don't practice it, which is the whole idea that we try to teach in this church about Jesus's teachings. To say, I believe in Jesus Christ and that's all I need to do, I don't need to do anything else. That is vanity, that is vain, that is empty, and it's going to ultimately not do you service. Believing in something is good, but believing will not change you. Believing you will not get you into heaven. Doing the teachings of Jesus, which he collated and synthesized from the wisdom and prophetic traditions of the Hebrew Bible and other intertestamental sources. Doing the teaching in everyday life, both the internal and the external works, that is what purifies. That is what gives you a permanent relationship with God. That is what liberates human consciousness from all suffering. We'll continue with talking about specific verses next week, next Friday. Let's take the second cup of blessing. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother of the universe, help us to always remember that the only permanent joy we can experience and attain is you. In meditation, may we seek you. In prayer, may we seek you. In spiritual study, may we seek you. And in serving the vulnerable, the poor, the sick, the elderly, may we seek you. May we realize that this seeking and this attainment of you is the only permanent pleasure there is. Let's not get stuck in the pits of quicksand along the way. May we speedily pass up all illusions, all transitory pleasures that will ultimately disappoint us, and seek you alone. Prioritize you alone. Amen, amen, amen. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Good Shabbat, and we'll continue this discussion next Friday with specific verses from Ecclesiastes. Have a beautiful weekend and see you soon.